Good morning. Welcome to the Point. This week in Lansing, again, there was some optimism that progress could be made in restoring some of those cuts made earlier to the budget, but the House adjourned for the next 3 weeks without taking action. There are a number of things developing in the legislature, however, including an effort on the part of at least one lawmaker, South Haven's GOP Representative Mary Whiteford, focusing on providing services to people who are leaving the state's correction system. Representative, I want to talk to you about a subject that, as you and I were just sitting here talking before we started, is much broader than perhaps I imagined it was when I asked you to come on the show. But let's start with some testimony that you recently gave, and by the time this airs, this will probably have had action in committee, about providing mental health services to people who are leaving the criminal justice system here in the state of Michigan. First of all, one of your statements was, we know we spend a lot of money.
Yes.
Some would say too much money on the prison system and some of the things that we try to provide, yet we also know that when those people leave the system, if they've been treated for some type of mental health problem or some type of drug problem, if they don't continue to get that treatment, that could be a real problem with recidivism. So what is it that you were testifying about?
So about 20% of our population in prisons are treated for mental illness or substance use disorder. It's $51 million that is part of the Department of Corrections budget to address the needs of prisoners while they're incarcerated, so in prison. But what happens when they leave prison? So many of these people are not connected to a psychiatrist, to services within their community. They don't have their medications that they need. So what happens to these people? They escalate and they get worse, and so many can end up back in prison again because they've caused crimes. So my bill addresses that. It's like every single person needs to have a discharge plan. And some of that happens currently, but it isn't codified and it isn't something that's funded and properly followed up with. So what my bill does, it mandates the Department of Corrections works with the Department of Health and Human Services to make sure every single person who leaves prison has the option and the opportunity to have an appointment made, to have their prescriptions in hand, to have a connection into their community, so community mental health or other services, to help them with other barriers, housing, food, just some way to help them enter the community again and develop into a fully functioning adult in the community, because they've spent many years potentially in prison where every single thing was taken care of for them. So that's what this bill addresses.
How would you attempt to do that? Because you point out they don't have those connections. So how do you create those for them? I mean, let's say you're in the run-up of being released. That's easy. Because you can make sure that you have visits made and you get prescriptions at that point.
Right.
Going forward, how do you encourage those folks to stay in contact with those services, and how would they be provided?
Well, we've ended up having some pilots in the state. So there's one here in Grand Rapids, Cherry Health. So they give the option for somebody leaving prison to have full wraparound services. They have a coach, somebody who reaches out on a day-to-day basis as that person needs and makes sure that the person gets into services. So this expands that into full behavioral health services as well. And that's how I envision this. Other states have done this. There's some programs to be able to help do it, to have discharge plans. You know, I was a nurse, and what I found is from day one, when somebody's admitted into a hospital, that they get discharge planning. Because the goal is not for them to stay there forever. The goal is to get them out. And it takes a lot of coordination and plan. So the funding mechanism for this coordination and plan prior to them leaving prison is really important. And the thing that I find, I mean, every single dollar that's budgeted in our state is a taxpayer dollar. But we have them in silos. So we have a Health and Human Services silo for health care. We have the Department of Corrections. And there's $15 million actually that go to parolees to address them once they get out. But that's through the Department of Corrections budget. So how can I use that money and actually leverage it and get some federal funds that match it, that'll make it a larger pot of money to offer these services? So it's always really complicated, but if we eliminate silos. If we focus on the person and make sure they get the care and the supports that they need, we'll have a much better system, and we'll have a much better person-centered focus to this.
Well, we've heard in state government, federal government too, with no particular success, but at the state level, we've heard for a number of administrations about doing away with the silos, having an integrated system where people can go to get services of all kinds. But we also know that those silos are pretty well protected by some of the agencies that possess them. So how do you do that? How do you integrate that kind of service, and how do you get the funding?
So fortunately, my budget is $26.3 billion. It's about 43% of the state budget. And I'm always looking at every single dollar within that budget to make sure that it's going to the right place, that we're able to leverage and get federal matching funds. Because for every dollar that we put in of general fund, we can get an additional $2 in federal matching funds for health care and certain things within the budget. So I also see that quite a bit of money follows as an interdepartmental grant. So that happens now. It's just getting people at the table and saying, okay, how can we best do this? And let's eliminate these barriers and focus more on the person. I had a meeting yesterday with somebody from another department, and they're talking about their money and their budget and their land, so that's DNR. I'm like, well, it's a taxpayer's land, it's a taxpayer's money. What's the best way that we're addressing this? And that goes along to conversations about behavioral health and the silos that we have. Let's focus on the person.
Talking for a moment about, again, just focusing on those people who may be leaving the criminal justice system. One of the things that seems apparent to me, and not all divided government is working well in Lansing, but when it comes to doing criminal justice reform, it seems that Republicans and Democrats have been working pretty closely together. Just recently, another bill you supported, Raise the Age, was signed into law by the governor. That puts Michigan in compliance with about 46 other states that treat adults 18 and above, not 17 as it has been. And there have been some other movements in that area. Is this one area where Republicans and Democrats really are able to cooperate, including perhaps on a bill like this?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm chair of this budget, but my Democrat vice chair, we work side by side on everything. And that's what I love about this budget too, and really about taxpayer money. It doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent. If you do the right thing by people, it doesn't matter. It's not partisan. I work really well with my department chair, or my department director, Director Gordon, and then the deputy directors of all the different parts of the budget, just focusing on the right thing, and then it's not partisan. And that's what I'm most proud of.
When you talk about getting services, particularly if you're talking about mental health services or medical services, it isn't just about people that are getting out of prison or out of the correction system. And I know you've worked on that too, in having an access line and being able to get people to have instant access when they have a crisis or the beginning of a crisis or a problem or need to get connected. Talk to me a little bit about how that works and how you'd like to see that change.
Yeah, so I was honored to be part of the Michigan Cares Task Force 2 years ago, where we went out and we listened to providers. We visited many psychiatric hospitals and facilities. And as I was going through there, I brought in some personal experience of knowing somebody who went through a crisis, and that person reaching out, trying to get help, and coming up with a roadblock every single time. And I'm thinking to myself, it's kind of like a frog in a pot of water, right? As the water's cold, the frog's sitting there, but as it gets heated up, at what point does that frog realize it and jump out and get help? Well, that's how it is with behavioral health. You can have a lifetime of symptoms, but when that person finally realizes that they're in a crisis, or their family realizes that crisis, you need to help them at that point. So I came up with a concept to have a hotline. And I've been working that through the legislature and working very closely with department officials for 2.5 years now. We're before the full Senate now, so I'm really pleased about that. I've got funding that I got last December in the supplemental to get this started, but it's the Michigan Crisis and Access Line. So what it does, it models a similar system in Georgia, where if somebody is in a crisis and you find out whether it's when they go into an emergency room or they call 911 and the police show up at their home, where we actually get them to the right place. I've heard time and time again from police officers, when they go out to a home, the only place they can take them is either to jail or to an emergency room. And then I talked to my local emergency room officials. They could have 50% of those beds taken up by behavioral health patients who are in a crisis, and they don't know what to do with them. So let's make sure we're getting them mobilized to the right spot. But the other thing is that, like with the frog scenario, when somebody first sees the symptom of a major crisis coming or looming, let's make sure they get some help right away. There are so many people in our communities ready and willing to help, from social workers to psychiatrists, psychologists, but people don't know where to go. So this access line is the Michigan Crisis and Access Line. So not only do we offer rapid response, but there's also a way to connect them to individuals in their community that can help them from day one. And like I said, it's part of the process. Our whole behavioral health crisis in our state and our country can't be solved by one thing. So whether we're addressing people coming out of prison, whether we're addressing somebody when they first reach out, or when they're in a crisis, let's figure out a way to solve this early and address the crises early before they escalate into something really, really bad.
And this access line would not just be for use by the police or an emergency room.
Yes.
This would be an individual that could have that number and say, look, I'm dealing with something, I don't know what it is or how to deal with it. Can you get me to somebody?
Yes, and you can actually talk to somebody and have a warm handoff. I had a conversation with a psychologist once, and I said, you know, when you go into schools and you're doing suicide prevention, what do you actually do? How can that make a difference? And so what she explained to me is they treat information as a baton, like when you're doing a race in high school, right? So when you find this information, take that information like a baton, hand it to somebody else. Don't keep it inside. So if you hear about a friend who's having trouble or difficulty, don't just keep it. Talk to somebody you can trust and pass that on. So that's the really important thing for us to address through this. Pass it on to somebody who can actually help.
As I said earlier, the House will not be back in session until the first week of December, and then only for about 9 days. But negotiations between the legislative leadership and the executive branch will continue during the break, and we'll continue to follow those developments. Up next, a freshman lawmaker who brings a lot of experience to her Southeast Michigan district. To the point.